I'd like to welcome Kelly Quinn, the chair of our next session. She's the Terra Foundation Project Manager for online scholarly and educational initiatives at the Smithsonian Institution's Archives of American Art. Prior to joining the Smithsonian, she was assistant professor at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and Sojourner Truth visiting faculty lecturer at the University of Michigan, where she won 2 teaching awards. Dr. Quinn earned a PhD in American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, with certificates in historic preservation and women's studies. Her dissertation, Making Modern Homes, documents the early architectural and social history of Langston Terrace, a housing project designed by African-American architect Hilliard Robinson for Washington, D.C. as part of the New Deal. In 2007, it garnered the John Reps Prize for Best Dissertation in American Planning History from the Society for American City, Regional, and Planning History. I'd like to welcome her. Thank you.
I'd like to add my thanks to the various institutions and people who've brought us together today. Not just my appreciation, but my great admiration, especially for Amelia Gerlitz, as she nimbly adjusts, I think, both the sound and light. It's such a pleasure in this moment to be reminded of the important and necessary luxury of art history. Thank you yesterday for an amazing set of stimulating papers, and I think also an extremely promising set today. It's also quite thrilling to see our footnotes and primary sources come to life, and it's humbling to approach the dais and podium just after David Driscoll, whom we're all indebted to. I think a lot about institutions and our institutional affiliations, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today 2 scholars who have formal affiliations with Black Studies programs. And if I may, I think that's often quite exceptional and seldom seen in higher education in Black Studies, and to have art historians chairing a department in Jeffrey Stewart's case, and then also receiving certification in Rebecca Keegan VanDiver's case. We have great papers this morning, one of which focuses exclusively and very carefully on the work of Loïs Mailou Jones, and I'm thrilled that in this museum, in this city, we'll have a paper by a Black woman about a Black woman artist. So thank you for that. I look forward to sharing your thoughts with the rest of us. But first, this morning, we'll hear from Jeffrey Stewart, who is a professor of Black Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara and is the chair of the Black Studies Department. He was born in Chicago and spent his college years, maybe they were curly, I don't know, but he spent his college years, I get so excited. Okay, so he was born in Chicago. He spent his college years in California at UCLA and at UC Santa Cruz before doing graduate work at Yale University, where he received his PhD in American Studies in 1979. He's taught at Yale, Tufts, UCLA, Scripps, Howard, Harvard, and George Mason University, at Mason for more than 15 years. He's studied and written about the issues of race and culture in art, history, literature, and music, and his most important research has been on the Harlem Renaissance, the Black arts movement of the 1920s, and his specialty has been on the work of the Black philosopher Alain Locke, a Howard University philosopher and thinker. Stewart has also authored several books, including 1001 Things Everyone Should Know About African American History. He's been a guest curator at the Smithsonian Institution's National Portrait Gallery, where he curated an exhibition To Color America, Portraits by Winold Reiss in 1989, on the German artist whom he'll speak about today, who came to the US in 1913 and specialized in portraits of Indians, Blacks, Mexicans, and Asian Americans. He also has organized a national traveling exhibition, Paul Robeson, Artist and Citizen, the legendary African-American singer, actor, and human rights activist. And it was through that work and publication that I first came to know your work in detail. In 2003, he was the Fulbright professor at the University of Rome III, teaching American Studies and the Harlem Renaissance. In 2008, Dr. Stewart organized the international conference, 1968, a global year of student-driven change that examined the role of students in the United States, France, and Mexico as social justice change agents in their universities and society. Most recently, Professor Stewart was a Charles Warren Fellow at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He, like many we heard from yesterday, will speak to us and cite as Robert Farris Thompson as one of the main sources for work, but then he will extend our thinking with Stephanie Smallwood, to try to argue today that our figures, Winold Reiss is a transatlantic exile and Romare Bearden is a saltwater African. Rebecca Keegan VanDiver is currently a senior lecturer in the history of art at Vanderbilt University. She received her bachelor's in the history of art and architecture from Harvard University and an MA and PhD in the Department of Art, Art History, and Visual Studies at Duke University, where she also received a certificate in African and African American Studies. Prior to her appointment at Vanderbilt, she was a predoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia's Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. She's garnered a number of fellowships, including the ACLS Luce Fellowship and Social Science Research Council Mellon Mays Summer Fellowship, and she was, in fact, a traveling scholar at the David C. Driscoll Center at the University of Maryland in summer. Her research centers on African American artistic engagements with Africa and images of Africa in Western art and visual culture. She has written and prepared a number of entries on such subjects as Oprah Winfrey, reviews on of Kara Walker's work, and then also an encyclopedia entry on the Association for African American Life and History, the organization that's meeting this weekend in Florida. So I look forward to hearing from both of you. Professor Jeffrey Stewart.
Okay. I definitely want to thank Amelia Gerlitz for doing a fabulous job of organizing this conference and persisting in the face of opposition. Reminds me of Frederick Douglass's statement to us that progress without struggle does not occur. So we're struggling here, but we're struggling in a good environment here at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And not only do I want to thank her, but I also want to thank Ruth Fine for a fabulous show and catalog and book on the art of Romare Bearden that has helped me as I was working on this talk, and David Driscoll, who's been a friend and inspiration for years and who has kept a tradition alive that often I think is under assault and under-recognized in our larger American studies or American culture. I also want to thank the Terra Foundation, which has supported these kinds of efforts and continues to do so, and without which probably we would not be here right now. In terms of this particular talk, I want to thank more personally three people. Douglas Kearney, a brilliant poet and professor at Cal Arts, who first introduced me to Stephanie Smallwood's work and suggested possible resonances with Romare Bearden. I also want to thank Victoria Hungerford, who's a critical thinker and former student of mine. And I also want to thank Margaret Vendress, who has been a kind of a companion on this journey in art history for me and who has helped me think critically about my own work and the subjects that I have somehow felt I haven't really selected, but have selected me. And you know, I mean, that's a kind of thing that's very interesting when you feel like the subject has reached out and reached for you and asked you to do the work of revealing the hidden resonances that may exist, and as I'm calling here, some of the anomalous intimacies that exist within American art history. So when I started out working on this project, this is kind of a continuation of a project that I did at the University of Berlin in December of, actually in December of 2011, where I looked at, singly at Winold Reiss. And the idea I was dealing with there at a conference on transnationalism was trying to problematize the general understanding that we have of transnationalism as a kind of arc of freedom that occurs for those who migrate internationally, who essentially leave their homeland and come to another place and essentially transcend the sort of essentialisms and loyalties to place that others have. They indulge in a kind of global cosmopolitanism. And the reason I was trying to problematize that is because I often feel that instead of actually becoming free-floating subjects, what we really have is people who come and identify with a particular place in that place. And when you look at, say, transmigration of European artists in the 1930s and 40s, even in the 50s, what you really find is they're not coming really as cosmopolitan people, but they're essentially identifying often with the freedom that a certain kind of whiteness provides them within the United States. And so that I think we need to think critically about transnationalism as not necessarily the new cosmopolitanism, but a new way of detaching, but then reattaching. And so that led me to think about and question in my own thinking what made it possible for Winold Reiss to come to the United States and identify and attach himself to communities of color that normally are avoided quite deliberately, I would think, by other transnational Europeans. What allowed him to connect to often segregated and oppressed communities and to find in those communities a source of inspiration for his own work. And in thinking about this presentation today, I wanted to draw on some of the lessons given by the work of Robert Thompson in his book, African Art in Motion. Although I think more and more I've thought about this project, I'm more and more interested in what I would call the trans-African aspect, the migration from transnationalism to trans-African. And in fact, I'm actually in that responding to the advice of my mentor, Margaret Vendress, who said, you know, spend some time on the trans-African, you know, because that's the thing that you really need to think about. But I'm still holding on a little bit to the transnational, just, you know, a little bit. Because what I see in a way is that Romare Bearden, who's not often thought of, is a kind of transnational artist and thinker. The way in which he reaches out to all of these other traditions that many African-American artists in the 1930s and 40s weren't that interested in, or at least weren't told to pursue. There's the Greek traditions, the Egyptian, I mean, I think that Dr. Driscoll mentioned that about looking at the Egyptian, which for so long was separated off from the African. You know, you go to these things, they say, oh, we're gonna look at Africa and Egypt. And you think, what up? You know, I mean, was there like a line there? Well, yes, there is a line. It's in your mind. In the way in which you think about Africa, you eliminate Egypt because Egypt has a culture and tradition that you can't actually dismiss, you see? And so we just have that over here. But yes, looking at those traditions and looking at Greece, and looking at Mexico. So he was a transnational thinker, I think, Bearden, in the way in which he traversed the boundaries, the intellectual and discursive lines that are often felt by and experienced by African-American artists. And then he came back and embodied in the 1960s the African in terms of the West African and put those together in a way that was quite unique. And anyone who really studies his work, especially his collages in the 1960s, I think becomes a transnational because of that. Because if you're going to really understand them, you have to go into those works, those periods, those places, those traditions really deeply. So that's kind of what I'm kind of struggling with, is also putting these two people in conversation, in dialogue, people who probably never met. I want to tease out some of the comparisons and contrasts in their work and how they use aesthetic traditions to create a kind of performative culture that might be called trans-African. And I want to use trans-African to think about transnationalism in a broader way than it is usually thought of. And I also want to explore some of the dialectical aspects of what I'm calling trans-African. So before turning to the weightier discussion of trans-African, I want to spend a little time looking at some images. Because after all, this is an art history conference, right? I mean, you got to have images. This is what I was writing this. I said, get to the image, okay? So the image is here, and it's hot chocolates. Hot chocolates, done in 1929 by Winold Reiss, presumably done after viewing the Black Musical and Dance Review Hot Chocolates on Broadway. Hot Chocolates featured the Broadway, or was the Broadway debut of Louis Armstrong, and the music composed by Fats Waller, who created the signature song from that performance, what did I do to be so black and blue? What did I do to be so black and blue? Which I think is like the song of the trans-African, right? Because that's kind of like what I'm getting at here, okay? But anyway, as you can see, it wasn't much blue right there, right? I mean, this was probably one of the most astounding Broadway performances of the 1920s, and it seemed to spur a lot of art. For example, in the Smithsonian's American Art Museum, I thank that museum for this opportunity. There's another piece, and you notice how that there is this sort of energy on the stage. It foregrounds women's bodies, and then the people are in the background, and in the foreground rather. And something about Hot Chocolates as a production had a tremendous effect on almost everyone who saw it, and of course it had an effect on Winold Reiss. So now, why is he interested in Hot Chocolates? Obviously, sex, fun, dance. Transnationalism is in itself a kind of dance. Across continents, for learning how to be transnational is like learning how to dance in a new space. Someone has to teach you those signs, and it's almost as if Africans, or those who are heirs of African, are trying to teach people how to live in, enjoy, and transcend within an urban space. Now, obviously, this is a primitivist fantasy, a world of black women, nude or partially nude, essentially providing themselves availability to the white male gaze. At the same time, there's music. There's an attempt here to kind of create music and visualize its effect. It's also a kind of form of commodification in which bodies have become objects that are consumed. They are the hot chocolates in his composition. But I also want to explore the possibility that this is something of a psychograph of the transnational, who also, like the Negro, must learn to dance to survive. Now, the three things I want to just talk about are in this picture, are among the many that we could probably spend the whole time just on. But one is the whole performativity of space here. The way that the figures are inserted in in this more finished piece, in an urban landscape, the whole sort of verticality of the space, the way in which Africa has spurred a kind of cubic interrogation of what it means to live in the modern world. The urban landscape is reconfigured through their dance. And it reminds me of Kobina Mercer's essay, Romare Bearden's Critical Modernism, Visual Dialogues in the Diasporic Imagination, where he observes that Bearden was playing with the box of pictorial space, noticing that in Bearden's compositions, these are not classical bodies who stand apart from and therefore transcend a pictorial space that was somehow empty before they arrive, but they are subjects in an immanent relationship to the social environment of fragmentation in which they are shaped and formed. They are in an immanent relationship. They're occupying that space even at the point in which they are transforming it through their dance, through their performativity. Of course, obviously, Hot Chocolates makes a simpler, but I think still compelling argument that these bodies escape immanence, the immanence of living in a segregated urban environment, by crushing, by going airborne to the swirl and defying gravity, which of course was one of the key aspects of these performances, the way in which dance was used to essentially create a kind of vertical above. These were productions, the films of which show that people were leaping and flying, and in a way that became a kind of metaphor for how they were experiencing and transforming America. They were escaping the oppression that was often the lived experience of daily life. Now, I think we can see a similar exploration of the verticality excuse me, that artists try to capture in portraying dance. In Bearden's piece on the right here, on the Savoy, of the Blues at the Savoy, flying, transcending, and redefining space. The second thing I want to mention here is that we notice this central woman figure here painting. This is an example, I think, of Robert Thompson. He has many principles that one can find that come from music and dance that are found in and inspire visual arts. The get-down maneuver that you could particularly see if you ever were blessed with seeing James Brown perform. There was always a certain get-down moment. Often when he would say, take me to the bridge, and everyone would become enlivened, and they would bend, and they would contort, and they would really feel and live the music. That sense he's trying to capture here, which I think is a principle of living within the space and playing and dancing in the space that I think Reiss was trying to capture here. But the third and most important thing I want to point to is the mask-like face at the right-hand corner of the composition. And also a little bit replicated in the one in the center off here to the left, but particularly the one on the right side there. I think it exudes a different mood from that of the others. It's almost a specter, a haunting gaze, looking back at the viewer, not in the twisted cubist way of the others, but directly confronting us, suggesting an almost accusatory return of the gaze of those of us who take in the scene. It's almost a critiquing of the rest of the scene, of performative primitivism. This is the lower frequency that Ralph Ellison spoke of, or at least one lower frequency, telling us a different story than the one of dance and exuberance the rest of the composition exudes. Now look at Romare Bearden's, The Street, 1964, In the lower right corner is a similar face, organized around, again, a single eye looking back at us. Like Reiss's floating head, it is enlarged. Only a portion of the head is there, like a broken piece of a large African sculpture. And it has that unsettling presence about it, as if it is accusing or confronting us. It returns our gaze in a massive way, and its massiveness communicates the weight of the dislocation, conflict, disarrayed yet improvised style that the rest of the street conveys. Bearden has learned, like Reiss, how to enlarge and detach the head from the black body and give it a criticality that the pieces of bodies other pieces of body don't quite have. And that criticality coming from an enlarged head allows Bearden's piece to allude to how the black people on the street got to that street, how they interact on that street, how the social forces still operating on that street constrain the black bodies that are rooted there, imminent bodies, not flying around like Reiss's, enjoying the freedom of the primitive. Rather, they are stuck in a situation that does not seem to admit escape. Both compositions capture the fundamental dialectic, I would argue, of the African American experience. The tension between transcendence and immanence. But in Bearden's, even the creative style of the Black Street promenade seems constrained by the built environment. Where does that mood in Bearden, only hinted at in Reiss's composition, come from? Now here I wanted to argue that it comes from the Trans-African. Here I am inspired by Stephanie Smallwood's and her book, Saltwater Slavery, from which I take this aspect of the Trans-African, that it refers back to the transatlantic slave trade and what forced migration entailed, and the resultant blurring and bloodied boundaries between captivity, commodification, and diaspora. And I think those three terms are connected in her way of thinking about this and what I'm going to suggest about this. Captivity, commodification, and diaspora, becoming, as she puts it, an unforgiving journey into the Atlantic market that never drew to full closure, unquote. Now, Bearden reveals that this transatlantic, trans-African process did not end on the shoreline of arrival, but continued in a lasting engagement with captivity, commodification, and diaspora that persists into the 1960s when Bearden began to do his collages. Instead of a migration, the transatlantic slave trade is a form of exile, a condition that exists and persists long after the end of slavery, captured in the perpetual moving of Africans out of Africa, but importantly, into relationship with one another that is mediated by commodification and that traverses the boundaries of language, kinship, nation among Africans who exited before and during the slave trade. So that African, too, was transnational in the process of leaving some interior nation and homeland, mixing with others from other homelands and nations on the shores and on the ships off of the west coast of Africa, forced into what Smallwood calls anomalous intimacies with one another on board those ships where bodies, languages, and cultures touched and rubbed against and caused friction with those of others. Bodies, languages, and cultures, such that a trans-African subjectivity emerged from that interaction. say people in Ghana, let us say, become involved in the international slave trade, as she documents in her book in the 17th century, because it outstrips in profit the trade in gold for which the Gold Coast was known. They respond to these economic opportunities by bringing Africans from other places in Africa into Ghana for shipment to the New World, a new world for Africans as well as for Europeans. And that this new world breaks down identification with one's kinship group or national place and links one's destiny to those one has never known or not known well before. The very concept of the African is in some way linked to this process of trans-African, where the Ghanaian becomes more transnational in the process of coming to America. And the identification with just one place is reduced. And a kind of mobile identity surfaces embodied in this notion of exile. Now, Stephanie Smallworth uses the term saltwater slaves, suggesting how the new cargoes were resented by the enslaved already settled in the New World, whenever the former arrived from Africa, because the arrival of the newcomers forced the trans-African process of identification to start all over again and disrupt whatever deals and arrangements and negotiations already existed in places like South Carolina, Brazil, or Jamaica. As she puts it, Atlantic commodification meant not only exclusion from that which was recognizable as community, but also immersion in a collective whose most distinguishing characteristic was its unnatural constitution. It brought strangers together in anomalous intimacy, a product of violence, and I think that's a key thing, a product of violence. The slave cargo constituted the antithesis of community. I'm sorry here. And we see in Bearden's The Street a kind of visualization of this antithesis of community as the pieces of people's bodies emphasize her notion that each person pulled into the space of the slave ship embodied a distinctive social history. Each piece is sort of taken out of the magazines and newspapers, represents a social history, the only part of which is now present on this street. I think Bearden was haunted by the reality, the intertwining of captivity, commodification, and diaspora, which he somehow captured when he turned to the medium of collage in the midst of the civil rights movement. Bearden's collages are repressed memories of the slave trade and of the persistence of a kind of middle passage of the soul that has been injected into the unconscious of this light-skinned heterosexual artist as a haunting, a demand that he represent the fractured nature of community and black subjectivity by trying aesthetically to, in a way, put Humpty Dumpty back together again, reconnect the broken pieces, really, of a people who became transnational through the trans-African effects and response elicited by the Atlantic trade. Black people's faces become pieces of the continent. Black subjectivity emerges in his collages as fractured but glued together anew, as you were saying, reborn, in an attempt to begin anew and forge a new identity out of the new composition of peoples as well as art, of cultures as well as languages, the arrival of which reminds the already settled that they have no control over their destiny. But Bearden's collages also do something under-recognized in Smallwood's formulation. That a new face appears in his collages built up out of the fragments of other faces means that out of the past dislocated identities and diverse social histories, the Trans-African, whether saltwater or settled, has met the challenge of captivity by improvising new identities out of commodification and the fragments of nations, kinships, networks, and languages given him or her. Bearden uses the cutouts from magazines and newspapers as a means to find a way to recreate and reconstruct a new identity through collage. The fractured community is the new community, constructed in a new place. And it is, in a way, the quintessential American community, the new Africa in America without easy reference back to the African continent. But nevertheless, an act of community formation in which the old traditions remain, but have resurfaced without references. There are no footnotes in this history collated in Bearden's constructions out of exile. Rather, it is a new kind of identity, one that uses the alienation of America to forge a new transcendence, and that also brings us back to Reiss. To be transnational means being able to reinvent one's identity using African principles of design and to represent the African history of captivity, commodification, and diaspora as the history of the present. The Trans-African, unlike the transnational, is counter-hegemonic. It's essentially an answer to the European dominance in art and culture in America, and it's saying that there is this lower frequency that defines America in a way quite different than any other place. Now, clearly, Bearden does this more effectively, I think, than Reiss, but I want to resist the temptation here to reserve the term trans-African only for people of African descent. For while this is a particularly black phenomenon, this sense of transatlantic exile as the product of migration, I want to argue that that is not an exclusively black experience, but rather that something after centuries of operation in North America comes to define the lower frequency of the American experience. Moreover, I think that there is a cultural politics embedded in this discussion of Africa that should not be ignored. If art history is more than just the discussion of images, but also a discussion of the work images do in a kind of war of position against the kind of decisions that produced the Atlantic slave trade, then it behooves us also to remember Gramsci's admonition that we ferret out those opportunities to create a broader, more capacious we, rather than settle for the usual, more comfortable us, that the system of commodification and identitarian politics has bequeathed to us. Certainly, Reiss comes to Africa through the lens of primitivism. But I would assert that for much of the 20th century, almost every Western artist comes to Africa through primitivism, because that is how racism introduces Africa to many of the outsiders. At root, the trans-African is a transatlantic exile who also is unable to return to his or her previous history after the transatlantic journey, but is able to improvise the strategies of saltwater passage to create a new transatlantic home. Transatlantic exile also describes Reiss. He is fleeing his German identity. After coming to the United States in 1913, painting Native Americans, Mexicans, and succeeding as a modernist designer, especially of commercial interiors, Reiss returned to Germany in 1922, a trip on which he traveled and in particular did sketches of the Oberammergau players. The portraits were powerful, but Reiss was aghast at the racism against Jews inherent in the performance of the Passion Play in his native homeland. He never returned to Germany. He couldn't go back. When he had an exhibition of his new portraiture, which was mostly of Mexicans and Germans, he placed inside the cover what he called an imaginative that I think was clearly autobiographical. It's not a great work, being an example of his evolving Africart Deco design work. But I think it pulls together much of what was happening to him psychologically. He had gone back to the mountains of Germany where he did those portraits of the unreconstructed Germans. Yet in terms of design, his eye was looking past that landscape and focused on Africa here in the African mass, generic as it is, as leading the way to the future, to his future. It is merely an inside cover illustration of the book, and yet I think it signifies that his eye of awareness was opened by the African tradition. He can now see his way out of whiteness. He had limited knowledge of specific African groups, but was dealing with the preference for Egypt and the distancing of it from the rest of Africa, which we've talked about. Interestingly, it was on this trip to Germany and in this opening of his eye to the African art, which he may have seen in ethnological museums in Berlin, that triggered his innovation in his Harlem portraits. Here he uses whiteness as the defining antithetical background in his new Negro portraits. Here Roland Hayes appears as a kind of trans-African mask. He couldn't go back, Reiss, in a different sense. He had become a saltwater German. And yet, in bringing us back to Reiss, I want to suggest how his knowledge, this experience of transatlantic exile, plays out differently for Reiss and Bearden. Notice, for example, that Reiss embraces the opportunities, let's say, of African design much earlier than Bearden. Reiss is doing this in the 1920s, where it is not until the 1960s that we really see it foregrounded in Bearden's work. I mean, the marvelous work of Helen Shannon has shown that Bearden was experimenting with African art and design in a kind of hidden way in the 1940s, but it really only becomes explicit and foregrounded in his African designs in his collages of the 1960s. While Jacob Lawrence is using African principles of design in his Toussaint Louverture and Migration series in the 1930s and 40s to create a profoundly African-American art, Bearden is looking toward the Mexican muralists and Greek iconography traditions for models and inspiration. Bearden seems to resent the demand by Alan Locke and others to create what Bearden may have felt was a homoerotic image inspired or basis for the Negro American art. And of course, I couldn't resist our own now iconic image here, which has been tracing through many of the presentations, but I think fits. The demand for him to do this African seemed like kind of the salt water coming back to haunt him, just as he had worked out all of the deals to become a true artist by essentially doing all these other traditions. I think, though, from the standpoint of understanding his position, as Margaret Vendress has pointed out, there was a salient difference between whites making use of African aesthetic forms and what Africans in America could make of these forms, while adhering to their agenda of finding the elusive tributary into the mainstream. The fact that whites couldn't claim any ancestral link was an important element. Bearden, like many other African-American artists, may have felt he could not escape the presumption of a genetic attachment to primitivism a threat to his artistic agency that never threatened Reiss. I believe that the civil rights movement freed Bearden to use the African tradition as a masculinist aesthetic and not be bound by its narratology in modernist art. Instead of an art of beauty, as it was discussed by Locke, Bearden could use the iconography as an art of pain, fracture, and transcendence without recourse to Western stereotype or caricature. Notice, for example, in Pittsburgh Memories, how the faces of the subjects are broken up, pasted together, contorted, piercing, returning our gaze, yet enduring and proud. There are no outlined stereotypical lips here. Notice as well an image that recurs in many of these collages from the 1960s, the image of the train. The train, the opposite metaphorically of the slave ship, symbolizes the agency of black people in the Great Migration, who migrated north to cities like New York and Pittsburgh, places of suffering, yes, but spaces chosen and redefined by black people. The civil rights movement epitomized this century of African American agency by showing black people could escape Southern captivity by improvising their commodification as needed laborers in Northern capital to free themselves from Southern captivity. Here is a reminder of what had been gained in the Middle Passage, a trans-African ability to improvise a new politics as well as a new aesthetic out of the broken shards of the Negro's new world. The civil rights movement allowed Bearden to return to the black street, the new Middle Passage, embrace commodified African iconography in these pictures and magazine cutouts, and accept himself as a saltwater African whose rituals and aesthetic principles were now at his disposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone, especially to Amelia, for having everything run so smoothly today and yesterday. So I just click. At some point in the early 1980s, Loïs Mailou Jones sat down and cataloged a series of her African-themed paintings on a list she titled Africa Series. Her 1938 oil painting, Les Fétiches, which graced this symposium's call for papers, appears as the first entry. The record then jumps forward to Jones's 1971 works, Hommage au Oshogbo and Moon Mask, the latter now in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, both completed after her first trip to Africa in 1970. I posit that it was during the 30 or so years that are absent from the Africa series list that a number of engagements with Africa and the African diaspora caused Jones to interrogate Africa and the diaspora through a series of proxies, or routes, that take object, human, and geographic form. Jones's interest in Africa, her graphic compositions, and her use of vibrant color are some of her artistic hallmarks. Today, however, I want to build up to a discussion of how Jones's use of mixed media and collage might be reconsidered in light of her Africa series list. Her use of mixed media, a practice that emerges in her Haitian work from the 1950s and 1960s, raises a larger set of questions related to how one might relate the concept of collage to the notion of a diasporic art practice. My brief analysis of some of Jones's work from the late 1930s through the end of the 1960s reveals not only her steady, growing interest in African and Afro-diasporic objects, bodies, and ultimately locales, but also a move from the representational to the abstract that might be considered in both aesthetic and cultural terms, a transformation that culminates in Jones's adoption of a collage or composite aesthetic that I used to characterize such works as Moon Mask and Hommage au Oshogbo. Jones graduated from the museum school affiliated with the Museum of Fine Arts Boston in 1927. She spent a year teaching at the Palmer Memorial Institute outside of Greensboro, North Carolina, before joining the faculty at Howard University in 1930. In 1937, with the support of a General Education Board fellowship, Jones spent a year in Paris. During her Parisian tenure, Jones was exposed not only to African objects, but was also given the opportunity to, in the words of Brent Hayes Edwards, link up with a host of African Americans, Antillians, and Africans who were studying and living in the city. Among them, Albert Alexander Smith, Louis T. Achille, and the Nardal sisters. Paris proved to be a particularly productive period for Jones. Here she is shown in her studio overlooking the Eiffel Tower, seated among 20 of the almost 40 canvases she completed while on leave. Her most famous piece, Le Fétiche, visible on the right. When Jones arrived in Paris in the fall of 1937, she recalled, quote, "Africa was everywhere. It was just the thing. All the galleries, the museums were featuring African sculptures, African designs, and I sketched everything," end quote. In some reports, Jones says that Le Fétiche was the result of an inspiring stroll in such galleries. With its somber palettes of grays, purples, and browns, its loose brushstrokes, its cubist aesthetic, and its African subject matter, Le Fétiche marks a dramatic break from Jones's previous painting style, which was decidedly more academic in nature. While Le Fétiche is often considered the culmination of Jones's Parisian experience, letters between Jones and her mother from February 1938 reveal that the painting was in fact completed within the first few months of her Parisian experience. Moreover, Wendy Grossman suggests that the roots or the inspiration for Le Fétiche may have taken root on the other side of the Atlantic, and Grossman offers a compelling visual argument that the masks in Le Fétiche come from Walker Evans' 1935 photographic portfolio produced for the Museum of Modern Art. Regardless of its source material, Le Fétiche represents one of Jones's earliest routes to Africa, vis-a-vis a melange of African art objects collected in the West. However, it is important to note that Paris was Jones's point of contact not only with African objects, but with Afro-diasporic individuals. Her interaction with the Afro-diasporic intellectual circle began as soon as she set foot on French soil. When Jones disembarked in Le Havre in September of 1937, the Martinican scholar and fellow Howard University professor Louis T. Achille was there to greet her. Jones spent her first month in Paris living with Achille's family before moving into her own studio. Jones credited her time with Achille as speeding up her language acquisition, but it is also probable that Achille facilitated Jones's introduction to a constellation of other Afro-Caribbean and African intellectuals in Paris. Visual evidence of such interactions, I surmise, can be found in a pair of portraits from 1938. La Tête du Nègre and Jean Martiniquez. In La Tête du Nègre, the bust of a young man fills the entire canvas. The top of his natural hairstyle and his shoulders bound the painting's edges. Rather than situating her sitter in an identifiable environment, Jones takes his countenance as her subject. The title of the work suggests a play on anthropological or ethnographic titling practices, specifically the discipline of phrenology, in which head measurements are used to make determinations about moral and psychological traits. However, Jones paints a portrait rather than provides a type or stock painting. Jones's model is not characteristically or stereotypically quote-unquote African, but instead more racially hybrid. Her use of neg in lieu of a specific geographic locale and her sitter's racial hybridity exposes the global connotations of blackness in interwar Paris that she was experiencing firsthand. With La Tête du Nègre, Jones moved away from an object-centered relationship with Africa towards one that incorporates peoples of African descent and in some ways begins to capture a sense of diasporic subjecthood. With Jean Martiniquez, Joan again plays with ethnographic titling practices, and here indicates her sitter's country of origin. In the horizontal portrait, Jane sits against a wall of flesh-colored stripes that range from light caramel to dark brown. Her dress signals her diasporic roots and is in some ways Jones's interrogation of diaspora in sartorial terms. A red and green headscarf matches a wrap pinned loosely around her shoulders, and on her wrist, the light catches on a bangle of shell or quill. When you see the work in person, you'll note that Jones uses an imposter to really build up the folds of the wrap. However, I contend that Jean is more than just a portrait of a Black individual Jones encountered while in Paris, but evidence of her awareness of members of the Afro-diasporic intelligentsia. In an undated letter, most likely from the end of November in 1937, Jones described attending a performance by Marian Anderson with, quote, 2 girls from Martinique, Jean Zamia, who was visiting her sister, Mademoiselle Nardal. I am doing a portrait of Jean, end quote. I posit that the portrait of Jean Martiniquez is a portrait of Jane Nardal, who would have been in Paris visiting her sister Paulette, her identity obscured by Jones's translation of Jane to Jean. The Nardal sisters, who were cousins of Louis T. Achille, hosted a weekly literary salon and were also behind the publication of La Revue de Mon Noir, a short-lived publication that was influential in theorizing and promoting Black internationalism. Together, La Tête du Nègre and Jean should be viewed as Jones' attempt to explore notions of the diaspora via the interrogation of human bodies here located in interwar Paris. Jones returned to Howard in the fall of 1938, and during the 1940s produced a series of social realist portraits celebrating the African-American experience, which might at a different time be reconsidered in light of what I consider to be Jones's nascent diasporic portraiture practice. Evidence of Jones's interest in seeking a way to Africa can be found in a proposal she sent to the Rosenwald Fund in 1945. The work plan outlined her desire to spend time in Paris, followed by a trip to Liberia, where she intended to study the art and culture of the Vai and Loma in the northwest region of the country. While ultimately unsuccessful in her quest for funding, the application elucidates Jones's early interest in traveling to Africa, a feat she would not achieve for another 20 years, and suggests that the quote-unquote idea of Africa as manifested in African objects and bodies circulating in the West was not enough. After submitting the application materials, Africa remained on Jones's mind and in her work. She busied herself with illustrations for the Liberian Centennial Commission. Fellow Howard University professor Hilliard R. Robinson served as technical director for the commission, which was planning a celebration and victory exposition to be held in Monrovia from 1947 to 1949. It was Robinson who most likely was responsible for Jones's involvement and commissioned her to illustrate the publicity pamphlet that was published in 1946. The cover of which is shown here. With its depiction of 3 Liberian types, it resonates visually with the posters produced for the 1931 French colonial exposition that Mia discussed yesterday. Because the Centennial Exposition and Jones's funding for a trip to Africa never materialized, in some ways, Jones was forced to find another route to Africa. In 1953, 15 years after her first Atlantic crossing in 1937, Jones wed Haitian graphic designer Louis Vergenard Pierre Noël in the south of France. Their marriage established a triangular route between Haiti, France, and the United States that Jones would traverse regularly for the rest of her life. In the summer of 1954, the pair enjoyed a belated honeymoon in Pierre Noël's home country. With her trip to Haiti, Jones joined a long list of African-American artists, scholars, and writers who had traveled to the Caribbean. Writing at the turn of the century, Pauline Hopkins described Haiti as a stepping stone to Africa. More recently, Krista Thompson argues that works by African-American artists completed in Haiti during the first decades of the 20th century were, quote, central in forging diasporic links between African-American and Haitian contemporaries, end quote. Thompson articulates how the act of making African-American art in Haiti carries with it diasporic connotations. For Jones and her fellow African-American artists, Haiti emerges as a pivotal waypoint for the exploration of the African diaspora. Jones would later tell an interviewer, quote, "For me, Haiti is Africa, for it marvelously expresses the roots, links, and ties to Mother Africa. I feel that Haiti, Black America, and Africa are one," end quote. Thus, Haiti was the vehicle or the proxy through which myriad roots, links, and ties to Africa were both exposed and made. After Aaron Douglas spent time in Haiti in the 1930s, Alain Locke criticized Douglas's subsequent, quote, retreat from his bold earlier style to mild local color impressionism, end quote. Where Haiti seemed to temper Douglas's palette, Jones's work underwent dramatic shifts as she gradually abandoned her representational impressionistic style for more graphic, abstract, and brightly colored compositions. For Jones, Haiti functioned as an aesthetic and cultural laboratory of sorts that enabled her to experiment with new artistic techniques, mediums, and subjects. In a 1995 interview with a reporter for the Washington Post, Jones described that her time in Haiti was like, quote, learning a new vocabulary, the colors, the patterns, the different cultural traits and practices, end quote. I argue that the acquisition of this new diasporic vocabulary results not only in new subject matter in Jones's work, but also the development of what I term a new diasporic grammar or syntax, which manifests as collage. A look at the pieces completed in her first few summers in Haiti foreshadow this transformation that takes hold most patently in her work from the 1970s and 1980s. Paintings like Église Saint-Joseph that are quasi-impressionist scenes that belied her European training. With her position just outside of the action, Jones establishes herself as an observer rather than an active participant or insider in the square's daily activity. In Peasant Girl, on the right, also completed in the summer of 1954, Jones's gaze rests on a young girl seated against a low wall. The work resembles Jones's portraits from the 1940s in that the figure dominates the compositional frame, and her eyes are averted. However, the work's relative flatness, its pictorial emphasis on the girl's hands and bare feet, and the presence of a rough basket between her legs all indicate a real shift from her previous work. One example of this evolution is her unpublished oil painting, Les Barques Port-au-Prince, from 1957, and the 1958 watercolor shapes, the latter in the collection of the National Museum here. Les Barques is both a documentation of a specific locale and a meditation on form. The long horizontal canvas is filled with the triangular sails of the boats moored in the harbor. The sharp lines of the jibstays, masts, and hulls work together and work with the larger geometric shaped sails to create an angular pattern that fuses the composition in a fashion reminiscent of Jones's early textile designs from the late 1920s. Shapes, as its title implies, takes geometric and curvilinear shapes as its subject in lieu of any patent figural form. By 1960, one finds Jones beginning to experiment with mixed media. In Cockfight, Jones employed a collage technique that cemented her temporary abandonment of the representational. Rather than create an immediately recognizable subject, here Jones combines painted and mixed media elements to form a deconstructed rooster that emerges from the kinetic composition. Cock, French for rooster, cut from newspaper, is positioned above the painted work fight, indicating the work's title, a reference to the popular Haitian pastime of fighting roosters. while its composition is a nod to Cubist collage. Jones's later experiments with collage in the mid to late 1960s are thought by some to be evidence of Bearden's influence. Bearden credited with championing collage among African-American artists in the 1960s. But cockfight seems to be evidence that Jones's use of collage may have predated Bearden's widespread use of the medium. In another work from this period, Marche de Kinskoff, Haiti from 1962, we see Jones experimenting with an elongation of figures, a Kirchner-esque compressed compositional space, and the application of thick highlighting lines that lend a geometric quality to the composition, evincing Jones's eventual turn towards the abstract. Turning now to Jones's use or adoption of collage, I want to suggest that this switch in technique may be in part connected to Jones's familiarity with Haitian voodoo practices. In 1963, Jones produces a trio of mixed media works entitled Veve Voodoo I and Veve Voodoo II. The pieces document Jones's ongoing fascination with voodoo symbolism, specifically the veves, or cornmeal ideograms drawn by the priest to attract specific gods. Jones's knowledge of the practices came both from firsthand experiences in Haiti and through books. In her library, she owned both volumes of Philip Sterling's 1953 Veve Voodoo. Veve Voodoo II, shown here, is a mix of text, image, and materials. While two veves appear on either side of the composition, the viewer's eye is drawn to the multi-layered nature of the work, and with the visible glue bubbles, the act of pasting that brought the piece to fruition. Works such as these illustrate how far Jones had evolved artistically since her 1938 Le Fétiche, a growth facilitated and spurred on by her exposure to Haitian art and culture. A contemporary photograph of voodoo ground drawings suggests that Jones's use of collage may have also been part of her effort to document what she witnessed. In the photograph, a series of ideograms drawn on the ground are accompanied by an assortment of three-dimensional objects that are at times placed on top of the drawn veves. In her Veve Voodoo II, recently restored by the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, Jones works over the composition to such an extent that it is as if she has mimicked the additive nature of the ritual itself. Here, collage functions as an aesthetic solution for documenting a cultural event. In 1996, one finds Jones applying to Howard for research funds to support a three-phase project she titled The Black Visual Artist, which would support a documentation of Black contemporary art practices in the United States, Haiti, and in Africa. Her proposal detailed her intent to compile a photographic archive of diasporic and African contemporary art that Howard students and faculty could use in their research. The thousands of photographs she took are actually still housed in boxes at the Moreland Spin Garn. Jones spent the summer of 1968 conducting research in Haiti, and in 1970 began the third phase of research in Africa. In April 1970, before the official close of the academic year, Jones departed for a 4-month African tour. During the summer of 1971, Jones returned to Haiti, where she completed a series of African-themed works, among them the mixed media Moon Mask, which appears as number 3 on the later Africa series list. In Moon Mask, 2 trios of horizontal lines divide the canvas into 3 registers, the top and the bottom of which are filled with graphic designs inspired by Ethiopian textiles. At the center of the composition is a replica of a Kweli mask from West Africa that Jones fashioned out of paper mache. The three-dimensionality of the mask, seen clearly here in this photo borrowed from the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Eye Level blog, shows how the 3 dimensions of the mask contrast with the flat painted surface. Moon Mask has elsewhere been interpreted as Jones's attempt to reconcile different African motifs in one composition. However, with the inclusion of 2 black faces shown flanking the mask in profile, and the fact that the work was completed in Haiti suggests that the piece might also be a commentary on the African diaspora. In tracing the evolution of Jones's aesthetic from her time in Paris through her summers in Haiti up until she travels to Africa in 1970, one notes that Jones begins to develop what I consider a diasporic art practice that is characterized as post-European by a move from the representational to the abstract and its requirement of contact and translation between Black cultural forms. Jones's turn to collage at the same moment that her diasporic encounters intensify and extend in duration demonstrates that her work, like notions of Blackness more generally, is characterized by its composite nature and its pulling from a range of geographical, visual, and cultural histories. In short, collage, the act of piecing together disparate elements and the combining of signs and signifiers, function as a solution, both cultural and aesthetic, for dealing with her varied experiences. Thank you.
I want to thank again our speakers for this really provocative set of papers that I think, to my way of thinking, ask us to consider at least two sets of ideas that I'd like to pose to each of you, and then see if we can maybe have a brief conversation and exchange, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Know that we are recording this, and we'll be using microphones to have speakers from the questioners, interlocutors from the audience pose their questions. And I think Amelia and Anne perhaps are coming around with those microphones. For me, this is quite a nice set of papers asking us to think about people we think we know and maybe to see them in different ways. I'm especially pleased, as someone who studies urban America, to see your careful attention, Rebecca VanDiver, to place and the kind of ways in which places inform Loïs Mailou Jones's practice, especially your attention to what happens for her in DC, Paris, and Haiti. I also quite like the ways in which you, Professor Stewart, ask us to think about both the German mountains and the urban streets and how that can inform the lives of artists. For me, I always want more of that, and to think more precisely about how particular neighborhoods, harbors, communities, performances, and stage help us shape our understanding of an artist's practice. I'm also quite interested in the kind of ways in which you both, I think, seemingly overnight were able to incorporate slides and images referring back to yesterday's presentation. So I want to salute the introduction of Rich and Barte's Feral Benga, and then also that wonderful problematic cover from the Colonial Exhibition in Paris from 1931. Thanks so much for that. I'm intrigued, Rebecca VanDiver, the way you talk about the phrase diasporic art practice and the kind of ways in which you say that Loïs Mailou Jones develops a grammar that's drawing from the African diaspora. When I hear grammar or references to syntax, I often think about parts of speech. And I liked quite, Professor Stewart, how you ask us really to call special attention to the kind of action verbs that your artist Reiss and Barte are engaged in. And I'd like just to review some of those kinds of action verbs in a conversation. I'm also quite interested in the way that you remind us, Dr. Stewart, of Gramsci's admonition, challenge to us to think not just about we, but about us, And so to think about pronouns and the kinds of pronouns that are at play here. So place and parts of speech are two things that I think are quite interesting and that are suggestive for us as we think about how to write about the influence of Africa on American art in particular. Because like you, Dr. Stewart, and the Terra Foundation, I'm interested in this notion of conversation and anomalous intimacies. I'm wondering if you could think about, Rebecca, you offer us this notion of the diasporic art practice. How useful is that of a term? And Professor Stewart, if you could help us think about Trans-African and the salt water. These are two new phrases that we have not heard, at least yesterday. So I'm wondering, Rebecca, how do they resonate for you? And then, Professor Stewart, how do Rebecca's ideas resonate for you? So if we could think across these phrases.
You're not going to get us to argue with one another.
Yes. No, I just want to conversate.
So about this idea of a diasporic art practice.
Yes.
I think that idea stems from my interest in trying to conceptualize what we make of African-American artists who I view sort of as re-entering the diaspora and sort of traveling to these different locales and making work in these places,
yes.
As not being the influence of those travels and sort of sites and sort of they're sort of seeing these new visual vocabularies being employed by artists working in Africa, working in the Caribbean. So that idea, and I'd be interested to know if you think that term, a diasporic art practice, can be applied to an African-American artist who's sort of making work at mid-century, or if that term is ill-suited. Mm-hmm. But I think that what I was trying to get at with showing the evolution of Jones's work is that she clearly is adopting and learning a new vocabulary, a new set of symbols and signs that she then has to, and that idea of grammar, sort of putting it back together, so coming up with a new syntax or sort of a grammar, and she sort of experiences that in Haiti, and I viewed these works as sort of very experimental, and we see them really come to fruition in her works from the 70s and 80s, where she's combining motifs that draw from across Africa and Haiti in that way, I think, are sort of inherently diasporic in their nature. So I don't know if that addresses.
It does. I'm also interested, thank you for that. I'm also interested in whether what you've heard today, and you're thinking on your feet, whether this notion of the trans-African, as Jeffrey Stewart has presented it, could be a useful term for your work as well.
Well, since I hadn't
yes,
thought of it
this
before.
is the cruel part.
I mean, I think I think that what both of the papers were really getting at is that there's this need to sort of come up with a way to describe the experience of these artists and sort of how they are in the world and how what work they're producing in the world and how that it reflects that. So I think in the way in which Dr. Stewart sort of expressed that ideology of sort of trans-African, that it could be applicable in some ways in a very fruitful manner.
Yes, yes.
Well, let me say that I was really quite pleased that the two papers seem to be in conversation, and what I like about Loïs Jones, who I was, privileged enough to meet and talk to, is this idea of choice. In other words, that she's making a choice to not mimic the European tradition, but to essentially create her own diaspora. And that allows her to see these places as different combinations of the traditions that came from Africa to the New World. There's a sort of different calculus or chemistry in each place, and there are different traditions that have melded with the French and with other peoples that were deposited in Haiti and have come up with something new, which now she can actually access. So it's interesting that she is a person who circulates herself, as well as there is a circulation of cultural practices through her work. And that, I think, makes for a different notion of the artist, you know, who isn't sort of satisfied just to be in one place, but is transnational and is combining things that are usually not seen as inherently connected. Because I think it's important sometimes to remember that, you know, in the 1950s, especially from the 40s into the early 1960s, it was a period that Houston Baker calls a period of the integrationist aesthetics, where the whole drive was away from identification with an African or what was considered ghettoizing approach to art, and to valorize integration and moving into the mainstream. And so for Lois Jones to, especially I think as a woman artist, to take on an alternative and counter-hegemonic approach to becoming an influential artist, I think is profound. And so that the images you show that are 1960 and 61, these are periods when, you know, there isn't a Black Power movement. There isn't, I mean, there's some places, but generally speaking, the normative is integration and we'll all be together and doing away with separate institutions where you're in the wake or shadow of the Brown versus Board of Education. A lot of Black identified institutions are finding themselves defunded. I mean, it's a very difficult time for a self-identified Black consciousness, and yet we see it coming through with these artists who are not abandoning the European traditions, but recombinizing them and utilizing them from this African-centered position. And so that reminds me of what Dr. Driscoll said about how that he had to explain to them, oh yeah, well it looks like Kosovo, but it doesn't look like Korean, but I'm doing it from the traditions, the aesthetic traditions of Africa, in which I can actually depict anyone, just like you depict anyone from the classical European traditions, you know. And so that, I think, that move of being able to see the world through a diasporic vision, and also one that's not just movement, but also the history of oppression and domination and their answers to that are inculcated in these traditions, I think is a profound thing. And it's interesting that she's doing this at a time when, 1968, that trip to Africa must have been a very profound move for her to finally get a chance to go back to Africa.
I think we have time for 2 questions. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes. So, yes, but I think
these lights are unforgiving, aren't they?
you have a question, but you have no mic. So, I think first we're going to hear from Teresa Leininger-Miller.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you, Dr. VanDiver, for your presentation, and I'm curious about the moon mask, because although it's Quele, the title is Moon. So I wondered whether you found any associations with flag imagery from around 69 to 71 in the wake of the Apollo landing on the moon.
Oh, you know, I hadn't thought about, and she doesn't talk a lot about that piece in her papers, but I hadn't thought to make that connection, but I think that it easily could be. I think that it's sometimes, she even seems to mix her reference in terms of where that moon mask is sort of coming from, in terms, so, but I'll have to look into more frequently. Yeah, and they are. It's actually
Teresa Leininger-Miller just said, especially because there are tears coming down.
So Sam just recently restored the piece for the exhibition that was a few years ago, and you can see and they have it up on the Eye Level blog, which is a wonderful way to see how works are restored at the Conservation Lab there. But while it looks as if they're tears, what she's actually done is placed sheets of gold foil that has been cut as rectangles, and my understanding is that replicates holes that would have been on the mask itself. So I think that they've been read as tears, but I tend to think that it's a much more faithful, her trying to sort of reproduce what would have been on the mask itself.
A kind of scarification?
Yeah, or I think it's also to see for the,
I think we do have,
Yes.
okay, we have two more questions.
No.
I do want to just put a pin in this for one moment and say our colleagues at the Loïs Conservation Center will be delighted to know that you're showing off their work.
Despite the shutdown.
Yes.
Hello. Who's? Okay.
Yes, I think we have
Am I
questions lined
next?
up. Thanks.
Oh,
Hi, my name is Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw from the University of Pennsylvania. I have a question for Dr. VanDiver. In the videotape that accompanies that wonderful show on the Harmon Foundation that was at the New York Museum about 20 years ago, Lois Jones talks about being told to go south, right? Being told to go south, and she says something like, "What did I know about the South? You know, who were these people to me, right?" And she ends up going and she does some work, and then she doesn't really return there. And I'm curious about why she, or why you think she abandons the South as a place of inspiration, African Americans in a Southern context as a kind of source material, and ends up turning to these other experiences.
Well, so I've been thinking a lot about that question as I sort of am working through this manuscript project, and I think in part it has to do with this idea of, or sort of this interest in ascribing sort of a Southern narrative to African American artists and sort of their idea of a personal art history, of which Jones has no sort of familial affiliations with the South. She does spend a year there at the Palmer Memorial Institute. And what I've uncovered in my research is that she actually does revisit some scenes from Sedalia, North Carolina, in through the 40s, even though she's no longer in the South. But those works are really characterized by a sense of distance, and so she's sort of painting sort of from an outside perspective, sort of these sort of snapshot scenes. And I think that her move towards Africa and to Haiti is sort of facilitated by her marriage and sort of this, the acquisition of an extended family in Haiti and sort of being able to spend sort of an extended time period there. And she establishes a studio there that she maintains through the 60s and sort of returns again in the 80s. So I think that Haiti becomes sort of a proxy, sort of a familial proxy in the same way that we might talk about the southern states working for other African-American artists who have familial ties there.
If I could just say, I mean, I think that, again, the time period, you know, I mean, I've been working on Alan Locke, and I mean, to go to the South means engaging directly with, you know, the system of terror and segregation in the 50s and 60s. I mean, it's, you know, it's not something to be taken lightly. And so I think that that's one reason why she may not have, I know you think about somebody like Zora Neale Hurston with the incredible courage that she had to go south and walk alone as a black woman through the rural South. I mean, that's a lot of courage, you know, and so it may have been like, you know, a particular challenge to her to, you know, there may have been a discourse that she had against going to the South, you know, but I think as a practical thing, it probably would have been, you know, a challenge.
yes, thank you. My name is Achille Ryan Anderson, and I was a student of Lois Jones, and Dr. Driscoll will remember that the galleries were set up at that time where there are 3 galleries, and there was a permanent collection of African art in the entrance that you had to walk into to get to any other exhibit. And that was the culture at the time, that you had to walk through Africa to see what was going to happen in the other galleries. I want to ask this question about what we're looking at now at Howard. For instance, I'm on faculty, and some parents are sending their students there to find their blackness because of the integration process, that they have had the, say, choice to go to a school where they were a minority, or not segregated, and they have somewhat, in some descriptions of parents, lost their children in terms of the culture, the street culture, or just sitting at the dining room table, that kind of thing. What my question is about is that, is there a trans-regionalism that we can address? And some of the other questionnaires have mentioned going south or that kind of thing, and understanding that black people are not a monolithic culture, that we are very different, you know, and that is exemplified in the work, but also in the day-to-day situation at Howard, where you have people from all over the world, but certainly all over the country. I just want to, you know, if you can address trans-regionalism as an issue of our cultural development. Thank you.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that's one of the, I guess you would call the internal diasporic traditions that exist in America. You know, the migration within the United States sometimes is considered, you know, forced, and then other times people see it as chosen. And then so that tension in our history between being buffeted by social forces to move and then having the choice to move, to redefine ourselves, is a kind of continuing dialectic. I know what you mean about that, that sort of, it's almost like a gallery, in a wall gallery even today. If you go in the Department of Art, the art building on Howard's campus, there's a long case. The first on both sides, the case basically on one side, the first part of the case at least being work that was collected by Alan Locke that's on display, then also by Jeff Donaldson and others. And you know, there's a feeling of Africa in, and of course we all know that, you know, Howard University was one of the first universities to have an African diasporic program, and to foreground that aspect of, it's almost as if there are various meccas that exist. Harlem's called that in a way, but also I think Howard University, certain places in the South, Chicago being another one, that are, you know, essentially crossroads for black people. And also, I think, for white people who sense that there's something else going on in the culture that is not narrated in the official story of America that they get in schools. So, you know, Howard now seems to me to be one of the more diverse universities that I visit, because so many people come there for so many different reasons. That brother over here, I think, had a question. I just
want to make sure we all get a bite to eat.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking our speakers for this morning.